Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of Conversations on Modern Slavery, Free the Slaves podcast series. My name is Dr. Marta Furlan. I'm Free the Slaves Senior Program Manager for Research, and I'm going to host today's episode, which addresses the topic of human trafficking and disability. I'm joined today by Heather, Haley, and Sarah. Ladies, welcome to Conversations on Modern Slavery. So I think it would be great to start with a round of introductions so that our audience can get to know the three of you. So maybe, Sarah, would you like to go first, introducing yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much, Marta. My name is Sarah Hall, and I am a licensed professional counselor associate in the state of Texas. My current job is as the Director of Anti-Trafficking Initiatives for the Texas Alliance of Child and Family Services, which helps to support efforts across the state to combat human trafficking and to help in the recovery and restoration of survivors. And additionally, I am also a survivor of human trafficking. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Haley Patterson, and I am the Director of Austin Programs here in Austin, Texas, in the United States for Red Oak Hope. We offer a variety of services for adult survivors of sex trafficking and exploitation here in Austin, including transitional and supportive housing, holistic care, case management, advocacy, crisis intervention, and support in the community, as well as a variety of collaborative efforts here in Austin and around the world, which is how we actually know you, Marta.
My name is Heather Moga, and I'm the Director of Program Development with Red Oak here in Austin. This means I think about the how of accomplishing our mission in the day-to-day alongside of our team and thinking about how we want to continue to grow our impact.
Great. Thank you so much. And as I mentioned, today's podcast episode is going to be on human trafficking and disability. So could you please guide us into the complex concept of disability? What do we mean when we say disability, and what forms can disability take? I don't know if Heather, perhaps would you like to start off?
Yes. When we're talking about disabilities, we're definitely talking about a wide range of topics that cover a spectrum. They can be both visible and invisible, diagnosed and undiagnosed. They can include physical, developmental, and sensory disabilities, as well as environmental disabilities and mental health labels. They can be temporary or permanent, something an individual is born with, or it can be acquired at any point in their life. And like we said, some are visible while others are hidden and not easily noticeable. And it's also really critical to note within the disability world that what we're talking about can be very diverse. Two people with the exact same disability may be impacted completely differently and have very different needs and experiences.
That's great. Thank you. Sarah, is there anything that you would like to add to this conceptualization that Heather was sharing?
Yeah, so I really liked what Heather was saying, and I think that that is a really great synopsis of what disability is and what it encompasses. And at the same time, there's also a social aspect to disability. For individuals who do have disabilities, there are significant barriers to their ability to fully participate in society, to have equal access to the same supports that others who don't have disabilities may have access to. And even beyond that, disability can also be considered an identity. There are many people who consider themselves to be part of a community of others who are disabled. And really, that community has arisen due in large part to the ostracization and stigmatization of disability within Western society.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I think in one of the first conversations that we had after knowing each other, one of the things that came up is a topic that has remained relatively unexplored in the human trafficking space is exactly the intersection between human trafficking and disability. However, I know that the three of you are experts on this. I think that it would be very great and very helpful if you could explain how human trafficking and disability intersect and possibly reinforce each other.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I know we've all talked about in different conversations is the reality that disability is something that increases vulnerability to human trafficking. And at the same time, human trafficking has a significant impact on an individual that can lead to the exacerbation of existing disabilities and also create new disabilities for an individual across a wide variety of spectrums, whether that's physical, like Heather said, mental health labels, or in cognitive functioning. And so just really realizing that it's very bi-directional. They both impact each other in a variety of ways. And we definitely see that working in this space. And we see the benefits of recognizing that kind of on the both end in the preventative space, as well as the restorative space and caring for individuals, recognizing that human trafficking has a significant impact, but it's not the only thing that maybe somebody is navigating in the day to day. The impact of human trafficking is varied and wide. And at the same time, there may be things that somebody's been navigating long before their situation of exploitation that also requires support.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And you were mentioning at the beginning that disability can make a person more vulnerable to the risk of exploitation in different forms. So I'm wondering if the three of you can share a bit more on that in terms, what are some of the factors or conditions that make a person with disability more vulnerable, more exposed to the risk of being exploited and trafficked?
Well, initially, it's complex and there's a lot of nuance here. And at the same time, one of the biggest things that we know that individuals who are looking for someone to exploit, the things that they are looking for are individuals who are socially ostracized, are the people who they think will not be missed, are the people whom society does not value as highly as others. And even from that perspective, we know that individuals who have disabilities, especially young people who have disabilities, oftentimes don't have the same sorts of supports, structures, friendships, community relationships as individuals without disabilities. We know that they may be impacted in a wide variety of ways. And so when someone is looking to exploit another person, they're looking for someone who doesn't have friends, family support, help, community resources. They are looking for someone who is marginalized and who doesn't necessarily have the same capacities to recognize that the situation is dangerous or to even say no. And so different disabilities can make you vulnerable in different ways. Intellectual and cognitive disabilities, as well as developmental delays, can mean that individuals don't have the ability to recognize the red flags or to see the warning signs, or to think that, hey, something doesn't feel right about this situation. Or maybe if they do feel that, they can't express it in the moment. And it significantly increases the vulnerabilities. And we also know that disability is often comorbid or co-occurring with other vulnerabilities. Individuals who are disabled may be more likely to end up in foster care, which we know is a significant risk factor as well. They may be more likely to end up needing care primarily at home and not necessarily be able to go out into the community. And that can increase their risk for familial trafficking. There's all sorts of different ways in which this intersects. And here I've just highlighted a few of them for you. I'm wondering if Heather and Haley maybe have anything that they'd like to add to that.
Yeah, I think you did a great job in covering those things and the complexity and the layers and both how they may present with the different combination of disabilities or other environmental factors that contribute to vulnerability. Like one of the things that we talk about often is this idea too, that particularly for young people who have maybe already been diagnosed or recognized as having a disability, there may be this ongoing infantilization of them or being denied full agency by caregivers and educators, particularly around sexual health education and healthy versus unhealthy romantic and interpersonal relationships. And that can play into multiplying those vulnerability factors, particularly in the realm of sexual exploitation. And with each of these vulnerability factors or things that might lead towards exploitation, I'm sure we'll probably get here in the podcast, thinking through those in terms of preventative efforts as well, and how within both the disability and the human trafficking community, we can be talking about things in order to prevent or identify those who are survivors or victims of trafficking. I think kind of to that point, it's interesting. I'm a mom of a kiddo with a disability and also work in the space of human trafficking. And if you want to stop any conversation dead in its tracks, bring up human trafficking, and be very comfortable about talking about disability. Like, it is an interesting thing culturally. I would say, this is speaking from the Western kind of culture of being really nervous to talk about things like disability in a broader sense. And then also being really nervous to talk about the realities of human trafficking in a broader sense. So when you're bringing these two topics together, even within their own worlds, right? Like it can be hard. And this is the crux of this conversation for friends in the disability community or the disability serving community and friends in the anti-trafficking community to talk to each other and talk about each other with each other. Like it just becomes this very complex conversation that people, the bottom line is us being here together today is trying to encourage just, let's talk about it. Like we're going to say the wrong thing sometimes. We're not going to know an answer. Like my experience is going to be really different than your experience, Marta, and your experience, Sarah. And so like, how do we come together to talk about things that typically people feel very nervous to explore?
And Haley, if I can pick up on this last point that you made, why do you think that in the human trafficking space, the conversation on disability has remained so much marginal with respect to other issues that we typically address, we discuss more openly? What do you think is the reason that has made us less capable, perhaps, of recognizing, addressing, and responding to this reality?
Very curious what Sarah has to say. I'll give a quick kind of answer from my perspective. I do feel like we have come a long way. I mean, it's a relatively new field, all things considered. And so we have come a long way in the way we navigate larger topics like the impact of trafficking and trauma on the brain and complex trauma and how we care for people who've experienced those things, and come a long way in becoming more trauma informed and trauma responsive and finding ways to navigate service provision and preventative efforts from that stance. And I think we've kind of taken the disability conversation, not intentionally, but it's just kind of put to the side because for a variety of reasons. Like my background is in speech language pathology. So I come from a space of being super comfortable talking about disability. And at the same time, I entered this space not connecting that world with the world that I was working in human trafficking. So it's just, some of it is just the awareness piece, the comfortability piece, and knowing more about disability and that it is a world within its own like culture of disability rights. There's vibrant work that has been going on for a long time. And those two communities are just pretty separate. Like they're not necessarily having conversations of the broader sense of human rights. Like, and really the intersection is more significant than I think we even realize. And that's coming from like my tiny perspective of having a lot of experience working with individuals with disability. And it taken me some time being in the space to be like, oh, I need to be talking about these layers of what we're experiencing with our friends that we're working with in our program. And at the same time, like, who else is talking about the intersection of disability and trafficking? And that's obviously why we love Sarah so much, because she's been a big part of us, like learning more and having those conversations. So curious, Sarah, what you would say about that.
Well, what I'll say first is that you hit on two of the biggest points I was going to make, which is both the newness of the field and the sort of relative recency that it's developed in relation to things like anti-domestic violence and other efforts and initiatives over time. So that's one piece. And then the other piece that you hit on is definitely how siloed the anti-trafficking sphere has traditionally been from so many other types of organizations and communities. There are a number of organizations that I have worked with and helped to support where they didn't even really have community partners outside of the anti-trafficking space. It was like all their resources, all the things that they had to pull from were just others in that same sphere coming from that same lens, when really their clients could have been much better served if they had had partnerships and relationships with all sorts of different agencies and resources throughout the community, whether that has to do with disability, whether that has to do with social functioning, whether, right, like all the different things, doctors and psychiatrists and therapists and dentists. Yes. So I think that that's part of it, is just the silo, really. The other thing too that I think about initially is that, to Haley's point about the comfortability that people do not have when discussing these topics, is that when you're talking about human trafficking survivors or victims and talking about individuals who have disabilities, you're talking about two very stigmatized populations. And there's a lack of connection between those spheres. And there's this really great book called The Apple Doesn't Fall Far from the Tree. And it's an exploration of what are known as horizontal identities, which is an identity that you don't share with your parent. And really, the connection that has to this conversation is that they make a point in there that just because a parent comes to accept a different identity that their child has does not mean that they are automatically more accepting of other people's identities. So just because you might be okay with the fact that your daughter identifies as a lesbian doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have empathy for somebody else who maybe is part of a different stigmatized population. And so I think that we see that people who know a lot about disability and who work in that sphere have a lot of knowledge and compassion and empathy for individuals with disabilities. And people who work in the anti-trafficking sphere have a lot of compassion and knowledge about human trafficking victims and survivors. And really, I think it's a lack of recognition of how big the problem is and a lack of recognition of how big the overlap is between disability and human trafficking. And the last thing I'll say is that we tend to focus very highly in the anti-trafficking world on sort of three main diagnoses, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders, and depression. We also don't talk about how those in and of themselves can be disabling conditions. But the other piece here is that if all we have is a hammer, everything's going to look like what it needs as the solution is a hammer. And so we're not really trained to look at other aspects and to see and to evaluate our clients on the basis of whether or not they might have these barriers and these disabling conditions that are impacting their ability to interact with the world.
I'd love to add a little bit more to a point that Haley mentioned with regards to trauma specifically. I think in the anti-trafficking world, we have definitely made great strides to be trauma-informed and trauma-responsive in our service delivery as well as programmatic development. And I think, I'll speak for our specific experience and would love to hear if this resonates with y'all as well, that because our familiarity is with trauma, the impact of trauma and the symptoms of trauma in the population we serve, it makes a lot of sense that what we observe would fall under the umbrella of a symptom or impact of trauma. One of the earliest presentations Haley and I sat in kind of on this intersection, a woman who's a survivor herself shared a story of spending years in therapy and officially sort of coming on the other side of PTSD. She was no longer being diagnosed with PTSD, and the story that she relates, she was doing great therapeutically, interpersonally with people, but she could not finish her laundry. And what people were coming back to her and saying is like, okay, it must be the trauma. There's still some unresolved trauma to deal with. And she's like, I think I'm doing okay with my trauma, but it's not solving this conundrum of being able to complete these daily tasks. And she ends up going to a doctor, and the doctor says, let's take a look at ADHD and explore this diagnosis and maybe experiment with some meds. And alas, this was one of the missing pieces of her journey of restoration that actually solved this conundrum for her and brought this piece to her world, right, in her recovery journey. And this story just brought home, with such clarity, maybe there's more to the picture than trauma oftentimes, and we need to be creative in how we engage with clients and the questions we ask and the avenues, we're walking alongside of them to pursue. And so again, that's, maybe specific to us in the anti-trafficking space. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Sarah.
Well, what I'm thinking as I'm hearing the story is, wow, that sounds a lot like something that I experienced as well. I have been out, and it's been over a decade since I was trafficked. And so during that time, I have had a lot of therapy and a lot of support, and I have done the work and I have put in the effort. And also I have significant trouble communicating socially sometimes. I get very nervous and very awkward and sometimes don't know what to say. And for so long, we kept approaching it through the lens of, my significant history of complex trauma is impacting my social ability to communicate and connect with others who don't have similar histories. And it wasn't until I read an article in Nature magazine that came out a few years ago that really broke down the differences in how autism presents in women from how autism presents in boys that I went through and was reading that and was like, oh, this actually is describing a lot of my experiences. And from there went through and did psychometric testing and some, various different assessments with a psychiatrist. He might actually be a neuropsychologist, whatever. His title doesn't matter. But I was eventually diagnosed with autism. And that diagnosis has really revolutionized my life and my understanding of where some of my difficulties are coming from. They are not all attributed to trauma. And in fact, the fact that I have autism, which is a social communication disorder at heart, is most likely one of the reasons and vulnerabilities that I had to experiencing trafficking in the first place.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing that, and also Heather and Haley. This conversation is being so informative and so interesting. And if we can go back a bit when you were talking about the intersection between human trafficking and disability, all of you mentioned that having a disability can present a person with specific vulnerabilities that may heighten the risk of exploitation. I'm wondering then if there are some specific forms of exploitation or some forms of trafficking to which a person bearing disability may be more prone, based on your experience working with the survivors with disability. I'm wondering if you have encountered some forms of exploitation more frequently than others.
Great question. I think my brain first goes to, if we think about exploitation as like somebody using their power to take advantage of a human and remove the dignity and the good things that were intended for them. I actually, in our experience, we've worked with so many friends who had, we now know, because thanks to the point of Sarah around just like the value of having that clarity around disability for our clients, like we now know that there are things at play from a very young age that led to a multiplicity of types of exploitation, both within their family, some more subtle, some more manipulative, some more potentially emotionally abusive and psychologically abusive because X, Y, or Z thing was a vulnerability. I think kind of thinking about in our small sample studies of like working with people here, we've kind of seen the gamut, and I can't say that there's actually one specific type of exploitation that I've seen more from our experience like than another. But what we have seen is that if you are talking about a scenario where somebody has a difficult time registering somebody else's intentions, registering somebody else's meaning, interpreting meaning, and then problem solving based on that, which is a lot of what happens in various intellectual developmental disabilities, then kind of the vulnerability exponentially increases to any human that may come in contact with. So we've had friends that have been exploited by family members for financial gain, whether that's like not through human trafficking, but definitely through like benefits, their social security benefits, or taking, any money that they earn for a variety of things. And even thinking about like the interpersonal relationship side, that piece, and then being exploited by somebody that you think is meeting the needs that maybe your family hasn't, like that is a story that we tell across the board for all of our friends. And it may not be necessarily specific to individuals with disabilities, but for all of our clients, like if there is a person who is saying, this is a need you met, you didn't feel like you were worthy, you didn't feel like in school that you were valued, that it was hard for you, and you were probably told by multiple people that you weren't good enough, that you weren't smart enough. So let me tell you all of those things, and then I'm going to take advantage of that. So there's the I'm not really answering your question. I think what I'm saying is that we've kind of seen it all, and that's just our perspective. I don't think that I would say there's a specific type of exploitation that we've seen more than the other. But what is coming to mind is that deeply personal, like interpersonal relational exploitation that can either come from the family or from somebody who is purporting to be a safe person, a romantic partner. We do see a lot of that. That's not super helpful, but that's my answer.
So my initial thoughts when I hear this question is that, quite frankly, we don't have the data to know for sure one way or the other. And I think that's where some of Haley's hesitancy is coming from, is that there's not a definitive answer. All we can really do is best guess based off of our experiences, anecdotes, and whatever indications we may have or may be able to glean from the data that is available. And the other thing too is that this might be location dependent, right? So even if somebody with a disability is more likely to, for example, undergo labor exploitation in Central Texas, doesn't necessarily mean that they are like in another place, in another location, like just in Uganda. They might be more likely to undergo sexual exploitation, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be the same across locations. The other thing that I will say anecdotally is that in my experience, there are some types of disabilities that are highly fetishized, and that individuals that I have known in the past who have had some different types of disabilities that kind of fall into those categories were much more likely to undergo sexual exploitation, sometimes specifically as a result of the fact that their disability meant that they could earn more money, which is not a very pleasant reality, but unfortunately a reality.
Think along the lines of Sarah's comment about data, particularly in our context, one of the things that we run into is that there are some disabilities that are classified different ways based on whether they were diagnosed in the developmental years or in adulthood. And so what we end up experiencing with a lot of clients in our programs is maybe anecdotal data about I was maybe in special education in school, certain things might be more complicated or hard for me, or this is what I've experienced in the past. But because of either their disability, their family situation, their social context, they weren't actually able to access appropriate diagnostic services as a minor and a child. And so they're coming into a program like ours where people are starting to ask questions that they maybe don't have the technical answers to. And in order to obtain appropriate diagnoses, that's a significant amount of funding that is required, staff support to walk through this. And so the data is bad for a lot of reasons. One, because most victims were probably not in a situation where they were able to access appropriate resources at developmental ages, maybe because they were out of school, their family had, limited socioeconomic resources. But as we've been keeping track of data within our specific housing program, we're a small organization. Just for a little bit of context, we work with a small number of clients at any given time, but in the last couple of years of us tracking data, 100% of our clients are living with one or more disability. 77% of clients in our supportive housing program have been diagnosed with IDD. 100% of our clients have executive function disorder. And we've also seen other diagnoses on top of everything I just mentioned. And so again, just in our small sample size, and again, we're working with women who are survivors of sexual exploitation. But to Haley's point earlier, prior to maybe sexual exploitation, there have been a host of exploitative situations they have found themselves in or sort of currently find themselves in. I'm thinking specifically of employment and clients we work with who do have intellectual disabilities, who have to fight very hard to stay employed and to stay employed safely. And so a lot of conversation is had around how to prevent further abuse and exploitation in legal and legitimate employment opportunities. So it's not a conversation that ends either.
Thank you so much to the three of you. And before we were reflecting on the specific vulnerabilities of people with disability, now I would like to look at the after trafficking experience, meaning what are the specific needs that survivors with disability have. And I think that this would be very helpful for those in our audience specifically who work closely with survivors and certainly benefit from having more of an understanding of the specific needs of survivors with disabilities. Perhaps, Sarah, would you like to start?
Sure. First, we note that the range of disabilities that any individual may have who's coming into our programs, that's an incredibly wide range. And so in many ways, programs need to be prepared to individualize and help meet the individual needs of the person that's in front of them. We also know that many disabilities may not be diagnosed. So there may be as Heather and Haley were saying earlier, fees and charges associated with getting an appropriate diagnosis, whether that's mental health related, developmentally related, physical issues that may have been not diagnosed, earlier on because of trafficking, or even physical issues that are caused as a result of experiences that are had during exploitation and trafficking. And so really, there's such a wide range of things and resources and supports that survivors may need. I kind of go back to what I was saying earlier about how there's sort of three main diagnoses we look at. And those three diagnoses, the post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorder, and depression, all of those are disabling conditions. And I think that the anti-trafficking field hasn't realized that when we are working with a population that almost 100% of them will have one of those three diagnoses, that we are inherently working with a population that is disabled. So there's that.
I totally agree and appreciate just the reality. I think to your point, Sarah, that the best, kind of like the most important things we can do are be incredibly individualized, just like we're taught to through this like trauma responsive approach of the needs of the person right in front of us, and be able to offer a wide variety of solutions based on those needs and be really curious. I think the next thing from our standpoint in terms of like caring for individuals with disabilities is helping our friends get, like Sarah said, accurate diagnoses that answer questions for them if they're curious and are wondering why X, Y, or Z thing may feel a little difficult, or like there are other options for them besides just being in this program and offering counseling. Those two things would be very, very important on their own. And there's a lot more supports that we can learn about and connect our clients to. And we are doing them a disservice when we don't choose as organizations to connect with other people, both like in our community, in whatever country we're living in, and around the world, who are asking these questions and are providing solutions. So for us, that looked a lot like learning more about the disability serving community in our city and who is doing that work already and what may we have to learn from them a lot, and how might we also share with them what we're seeing and start that conversation so that it's mutually beneficial. And then I think kind of like I don't remember if this is the third or fourth thing, but I would also say that really helping our friends build insight into their own disabilities and needs is always one of the most powerful things we can do as a program. If any of our friends choose to leave the next hour or the next day or 2 weeks from now or a month from now, if we have helped them learn through their beautiful, brilliant way that they desire to learn who they are and what their needs are and how they can actually get their needs met and how they can advocate for themselves in other spaces on getting their needs met, then that is the most powerful thing we can do. We are not trying to be the solution for every human. I go back to something Sarah once said, and I'm going to get it wrong, but it was basically like, you, Sarah, were saying you were not asking every program to be the like catch-all and solution for every single thing that comes up, but we are asking programs and service providers and people in this space to be really curious about who might be and how to better connect our clients and how to better have these conversations so that the outcomes are more fruitful for our friends. Yeah. Along the lines of what y'all are saying, I think one, starting with this baseline assumption that you are working with people with disabilities in the anti-trafficking community. So if that's a working assumption, you can start getting really curious about who you're coming into contact with, what you're observing and what is being presented in front of you, and asking questions about that. We often organizationally talk about just how far curiosity and compassion can take us in this space. And I think one of the ways that you can build on that curiosity is, and I think you both referenced this, being very intentional about connecting with people who have lived experience with disability, particularly in the anti-trafficking space, connecting with communities who are already working in the disability realm and asking a lot of questions about what they're experiencing. And I would say for, staff in anti-trafficking agencies to take initiative and put some time into understanding how these disabilities might present themselves, and maybe just starting with the exact clients you have right now so that you can individualize the services that you are providing for them and make it the best case scenario in this instance for them, and working with multidisciplinary teams as often as possible so that you can bring this variety of perspectives and experiences to the table. I think the benefit of maybe interpreting experience through somebody else's experience has just taken us so far to understand what we're experiencing. And I would say getting feedback from clients as often as you can about what their experience was like and just what do you need? How can we help you? And being willing to actually take action on what those questions, needs, and suggestions are.
Thank you so much, Heather. And building on your final conversation as we are moving towards the end of this episode, perhaps we can conclude with one or two recommendations from the three of you for organizations working in the anti-trafficking space in whatever specific function they work, to be more aware and more proactive towards these issues. I'm wondering if we can conclude with one final thought from each of you.
Sure. I think if I had to make one recommendation for organizations who are working in this space, it would be to really learn and participate in trainings and free resources and opportunities, and avail yourselves of the knowledge that is out there in order to learn more about disabilities, both general and specific, in order to best support your clients. Because if you don't have that lens of understanding, here's all the many different ways that a client might interact with me, and these are indications that they might, need support in this area or might potentially have a disabling condition in this other realm, you're not going to be able to support them as robustly as if you did have that information. I always advocate for more training. It's part of just who I am.
Great. What's coming to mind for me is very similar, and it would be find out who in your community is working with disabled individuals right now. How are they supporting them? And see where you can maybe join forces to learn from each other, maybe inform them a bit about potential survivors of trafficking that might be in their existing population of people they're already working with, and create that two-way relationship to learn more about the spaces they're advocating and the resources they may already have access to and how those could support the clients you're already working with. And I think I'd just say maintain a posture of curiosity and compassion. I feel like we've talked a lot about that, Marta, and just like the value of that at the individual level as you're working with survivors, as well as the value of that at the collaborative level as we engage in this space and have conversations where, man, they can be really messy and people can come at it with a lot of different perspectives and opinions, and just maintaining that posture of curiosity and compassion so that we can actually see the people in front of us that we're working with, whether that's like our individual clients or the partners that we're engaging with. And at the end of the day, that is what actually drives us to notice, man, like this would be at the very micro level as a case manager. I was working with this client and I said, hey, before you come back next week, these are the 3 things we're going to do. Cool. And then it didn't happen. I wonder what I could do, what didn't work about that plan for my friend, like what didn't work and how can we shift it? And even that is like actually making a modification to care for the individual in front of you. That maybe the root of that is a disability, maybe the root of that is something totally different, or it's a combination of all the things, most likely a combination of all the things, but just being really curious about what you're seeing from the people in front of you and just trying something a little different. I'm going to write it down next time, or I'm going to write it down and you're going to say it back to me, and then we're going to see how it goes. And if that didn't work, our plan didn't work. The plan failed, not us. Let's try again, right? So like just finding ways to be curious in the little tiny steps as we engage with individuals, that ultimately you don't have to be a professional in any sort of disability serving space to do that. Like we can do that together as a movement.
Thank you so much, Sarah, Heather, and Haley, for this wonderful conversation. It has been extremely interesting, and I feel like I've learned a lot, and for sure our audience as well. So thank you again for joining us, sharing your time and your knowledge and your passion with us. And thank you for our audience for staying around for the latest episode of Conversations on Modern Slavery. Thank you.